My baby dolls, we're back again with another episode of Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and today we're talking a little Giants baseball. And we're talking Giants baseball not with the producer, Ralph Tycho, and also known as the Zigzag Man. And, of course, him and me, we do a show every week on Giants baseball with a Z in there for the Zigzag Man. But we got author Robert F. Garratt and his wonderful new book on the Giants when they moved to San Francisco called Home Team. And basically, he captures pretty much everything about the San Francisco Giants when they moved in '57, right up until the time Candlestick shuts down at the end of the '90s and into the first game at the current park, Pac Bell. And we're going to have Robert on in about 2 minutes. He gives a wonderful history of the Giants in New York, and we're going to ask him why they moved. We're going to have a great time with Giants baseball because I love the Giants. What can I tell you? Besides being a Yankees fan, the Giants were part of New York, and as all of you know, I grew up in Brooklyn. So Dodgers, Giants, Yankees, Mets, they all have some significance to me, even though I live in Red Sox territory up here for the last 24 years, and no matter how much I beg the Little Leagues to put in a Yankee team, they don't. Almost every Little League team in New England, you will never see a Yankees team, but you will see a San Francisco Giant team. In fact, my kids are on the Detroit Tigers, but you'll never see a Yankees team. That's disheartening for a diehard Yankees fan, well, like myself. But you are listening to the network, and the network is the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, of course, with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho, who produces these wonderful shows and gets the entertainment out for you folks at home. And, of course, every episode that I do is a learning experience. So whether it's the dead ball era or women in baseball or the Negro Leagues or steroids or anything that affects baseball. So we're going to have a show coming up with Doug Gladstone. He wrote a wonderful book years ago called A Bitter Cup of Coffee. He's going to be my second interview today, and it's a great book about those who were left behind by Marvin Miller and the Players Union when they came to an agreement in 1980 on the pension plans going forward, and how if you work a day in baseball post-1980, you're subject to the pension plan. And if you work 43 days in baseball after that, you can get health benefits. Prior to those who have played in 1980, 874 of them were left out, and that's going to be a learning experience as well. But right now we're talking about Home Team and the New York to San Francisco Giants. We're going to learn so much about Candlestick Park, and one of the reasons why I love Candlestick Park, although not many people who played there did, was because the Beatles, my favorite group, had their last concert there on August 29th, 1966. And if you have a bootleg copy of the concert, like I do, Paul McCartney even says on August 29th, it's kind of cold here tonight. Now, never being to San Francisco, always reading stuff about Candlestick Park, about the wind, and this is the summer. We're going to learn, boy, what a mistake that was to build that stadium where it was. But a little bit about the book itself. Again, in 1957, the owner, Horace Stoneham, took his Giants of New York and headed west to San Francisco. And, we're going to find out they were really greeted with open arms. And what Home Team presents in this book, is that, yes, we all know about Walter Malley, but we're going to see how important the Giants were in this move. And probably without the Giants moving, the Dodgers wouldn't have moved as well. So there's a lot of complex issues we're going to cover. Robert Garratt is an emeritus professor of English and Humanities of the University of, I think it's Puget Sound. He has published books and articles on modern Irish literature, including the recent Trauma and History in the Irish novel, The Return of the Dead. His baseball articles have appeared in Nine and The Saber Project. And without any further ado, let's welcome Robert to the show. Robert, how are you?
Well, it's good to talk with you this morning, Ian. We're having a nice morning out here in Puget Sound, so you're back there, so it's a transcontinental conversation.
Hey, you know something? About a year and a half ago, I had a over the seas conversation on Skype with the Italian Baseball League. Yeah, and I needed a translator. It was in Italy. So this is nothing new to me. I love parts of the country I've never gotten to. We spoke about Washington. Where does your love of the Giants come from? Number one.
Well, I grew up in San Francisco. I'm a third generation San Franciscan, and my first professional game was with my grandfather at Seal Stadium. Not to watch the Giants. I was much younger then. I was about 9, but we watched the local team, the San Francisco Seals, in the PCL. So I go way back, but I was a high school kid when they came, Giants, to San Francisco, and I remember very well the welcoming and those exciting days when you could go up and see Major League Baseball.
Let me ask you this. Let me ask you this question. And we're going to start at the beginning. We'll get into the crowds and what you saw, because I think about 200,000 people showed up to watch the Giants be welcomed in the city. The Giants of the 1930s and 40s were not good teams after John McGraw had passed in 32. But in the late 40s, early 50s, I mean, you have Bobby Thompson's, the shot heard round the world. You could hear Lou Simmons screaming into the microphone. You know, Giants win the pennant. The Giants win the pennant. 54, they win the World Series. In what a lot of people don't know, because it's been 63 years removed, they beat a superior team in the Cleveland Indians, who won 111 games. Why such a drop-off in attendance?
Well, you know, it's very. You mentioned a lot of things there, Ian, in your question. The Giants went back-to-back in 36 and 37 with pennants and lost to the Yankees. Joe DiMaggio was starting his career then. He was an ex-San Francisco Seal, by the way. And then they fell off a bit, as you rightly point out. And after the war, Stoneham, this is something that I think Stoneham should be given credit for. He saw what Branch Rickey saw, and after Jackie Robinson was signed by the Brooklyn Dodgers, Stoneham himself became the second National League owner to bring in African-American players. And the first all African-American outfield was in 1951, and it was with the New York Giants. He was someone who saw the future, and they profited from it. Their team got better after the Second World War. They were independent, as you say, dramatically so in 1951, and then in 1954 they won the pennant outright and faced this amazing Cleveland Indian team who won 111 games with a formidable lineup, and they swept them. And it looked great for Stoneham, but there was something looming on the horizon, and that was his location, the Polo Grounds, the neighborhood. Manhattan was changing. O'Malley saw it coming too, let's face it. And it was about ballparks. And Stoneham knew his days were numbered. Either he had to go into a huge remodeling program, which would affect the bottom line, or he had to think about somewhere else to play. And he started initially by thinking locally. Maybe I can go over to Yankee Stadium. Maybe there's something in the city that could happen. But those plans soon went to nothing, and he finally realized the unthinkable, really, 5-6 years before. He was probably going to have to move out of New York City.
And let me ask you this about Stoneham. Do you think Stoneham should be given the credit, because you mentioned, look, they have the first all outfield that had I think Monty Irvin, Willie Mays, and I forget who's the other one that was in the outfield in 51.
Well, the outfield was Hank Thompson, Monty Irvin, and Willie Mays. Willie was a rookie, but he was Hank Thompson and Monty Irvin were signed in 49. Early in 49, so it put Stoneham as really the third owner in baseball. Bill Veeck signed Doby in the American League, but the second National League owner was Stoneham.
That's right, Stoneham was. And my thing is this. When Stoneham was a hands-on kind of owner, you might say, he did get involved in players' operations. When he bought the team, what was that, 36, 37 he bought the team? I'm forgetting.
No, well, it's a little more complicated. His father bought the team in 1919 and partnered with John McGraw. And then the father was very smart about this. He brought Stoneham into the organization slowly. In 1924, Stoneham was in charge of tickets. Then his father put him in charge of travel. He had to learn in other words, he learned the organization from the bottom up. It wasn't until 1932 that he brought Stoneham into the front office and had him watch McGraw and Bill Terry and Charles Stoneham, how they managed player personnel and all of the intricacies of that. So he was a well-schooled executive, if you will. When his father died suddenly in 1935, Stoneham was the youngest man ever to own a National League team. He was less than 33 years old. So, you know, it was a shock, but it was also, boy, talk about baptism by fire. And his first year, the Giants won the pennant and went to the World Series. His second year, they went again.
Let me ask you this about Stoneham. Stoneham has a very interesting upbringing because, again, his father owned, the Giants, but he went to Princeton, I think the Hun School of Princeton, and the Trinity Pauling School. He attended Fordham University, but dropped out to work in a copper mine in California. And at his father's insistence, his apprenticeship as a baseball executive in Futurama. How did working blue-collar jobs, getting educated, fuse the kind of owner he would soon be?
Well, I wish I knew more about that youth because you mentioned the schools. Those were prep schools. They were very, very well thought of by educational people. And he had the advantages of, an affluent family background. But one of the things the father noticed was that he was a little soft. And when he dropped out of Fordham, he might be called a playboy. I mean, that would be the word you'd use back in those days. It was in the 20s, kind of something out of The Great Gatsby. The father realized this guy needed a little bit of hardening, and he sent him west to the copper mines, and he worked there for about 8 months. And it was, as you point out, it was work. It was labor. And it toughened him up, that is to say, the son. And so Horace comes back, and the father says, okay, you're going to learn the baseball business. Horace was not a student. And in his own words, he said that his college career was about 2 weeks. He realized that he wasn't going to be a college student. Probably lack of focus, lack of maturity. Who knows what it was then. He was a young man. But he certainly grew to be an astute baseball executive. And I think you give the father the credit for bringing him along the way he did in the business of baseball.
And when by the time, we get to the mid-50s, he's already been the owner. Probably about 20 years.
20 years. Yeah.
20 years by now. But how instrumental was his relationship with Branch Rickey in the fact that, look, New York is the baseball capital, for God's sakes. For the last 10 years, every year had a New York team, if you go back in time, except for, say, 1948 when you had Cleveland and the Boston Braves. You're going to be leaving the baseball mecca capital, even with attendance down, and moving to the West. And at that time, there wasn't a team in the majors past St. Louis.
That's right. No, it was an amazing decision. But to back up just a bit, the success Stoneham had as a New York Giants owner, he really only had one world championship in his entire. I mean, he'd been to the World Series, and you ask about his relationship with Branch Rickey. And doing the research for this book, it took me 6 years to kind of get it ready for publication. I had to do a lot of, I was learning a lot of things. Had the privilege of interviewing a lot of people. Maybe we'll get to that later. But I spent about 3 days in the Library of Congress looking at the correspondence of Branch Rickey to try and learn what his relationship was with Horace Stoneham. I found very little. There were polite exchanges and so on, but I don't think Stoneham had any real deep relationship with Rickey. Of course, he dealt with him, owners' meetings and so on. But I think it was more O'Malley. When O'Malley took over the Dodgers in '51, Stoneham had much more connection with O'Malley, and they had their relationship was a close relationship. I won't say they were, everyday buddies, if that's a phrase, but he got along with O'Malley and was closer to O'Malley than he was to Branch Rickey, and that may have been a facet of personality. It could have been a lot of things, but I think that's what I've discovered. And then, as you point out, in 1954, when he was on the top of the world, really the New York sporting world, that was the top of the world. That was the baseball's greatest market. And when you rise to the top, you're overcoming two very strong teams, the Yankees and the Dodgers. So he had 1 year where the Giants were the toast of the town.
And what was the lock that finally made Stoneham and Rickey say, look, we're going to the West Coast. This is it.
I think for O'Malley, it was a little bit more complicated. For Stoneham, it was pretty easy. Two things. He was in the oldest baseball park in the National League. He looked at it. He realized in order for it to be fan-friendly, in order for it to come up to standards of the day, he was going to have to sink a lot of money into renovation. His bottom line was starting to dwindle. After the 54 success, the Giants started dropping off in attendance. And by 1957, they drew barely over 500,000 in the largest market in baseball. Only Pittsburgh and Cincinnati in the National League were under the Giants, despite the fact that they played in the league's best market. So Stoneham knew he was in trouble. The second thing is the neighborhood. He was worried that attendance was being affected by middle-class white people, white fans who, rightly or wrongly, assumed this might be a dangerous place to go, especially at night for night games. And so attendance was down. Manhattan was changing. The city was starting to put in housing projects to take care of large amounts of people, and some of them were all around in Harlem where the ballpark was. So this was another shifting demographics of Manhattan changing. And Stoneham said that he got worried, and he realized it's probably going to mean I will have to leave. He saw the Braves. Stoneham was a quick study. He saw the Braves go from drawing 200,000 people in Boston in 1952, their last year there. They go to Milwaukee, and they break all attendance records for the National League 3 straight years in a row. That was not lost on Stoneham. Kansas City moved in '54. The Philadelphia moved to Kansas City in '54, and that was not lost on Stoneham, the success there. So he realized that this was unprecedented. All of a sudden, for so many years, there were 16 teams in baseball, and they were all in the northeast quadrant of the country. Well, now there's a little bit of movement, and Stoneham realized this might be a possibility. So this was on his mind. His first choice, Ian, was not San Francisco. In fact, San Francisco wasn't even a figment of his imagination. It was Minneapolis, where he owned the territory because of the Giants AAA affiliation, which were the Millers. So he knew he had access to that town, and in fact, the Minnesota people were quite happy to talk to him. They were very excited about the Giants maybe relocating there. So there were a period of about 3 to 4 years where Stoneham and his nephew Chub Feeney, who was acting more or less as a GM / vice president, if you will, would travel to Minnesota mainly to check on the Millers, but also to take the pulse and see, is this going to be a good thing? And they were concluding, yes, it was going to be a good thing. So there was some talk that maybe Minneapolis would be a nice soft landing for the Giants when Stoneham decided to move.
And let me ask you this about Stoneham. Yes, he saw the Milwaukee Braves, Philadelphia, the Boston Braves moved to Milwaukee, and the A's moved from Philadelphia to Kansas City with success. But now you're going across the country into a territory that has its own baseball league. You have the Pacific Baseball League. Billy Martin was there. I know Casey Stengel managed the championship Oakland Oaks. And, of course, you have the Seals, which, again, the Giants would be playing. He must have weighed the fact, look, we're leaving New York after 60-something years, and we're going past the Mississippi, where you're not going to be around anyone but the Dodgers. Did he have to weigh heavily whether to take that risk or not?
Well, at first San Francisco did not seem like an attractive place. But a number of things sort of fell into line. One was that San Francisco, in 1954, passed a bond issue. They raised $5 million for the sole purpose of building a major league facility to attract baseball. That was unprecedented in the city's history. The second thing was that O'Malley had his eye on Los Angeles, and he bought the Los Angeles Angels PCL franchise, which gave him the rights to Los Angeles. He did it in 1957 when he approached Wrigley, who owned the LA Angels, as they were called, the PCL LA Angels, and he made a deal which really opened LA as a possibility. The third thing was that there was a fellow called Matthew Fox, and this guy was in charge of a company that in those days sounded like the future. It was called Skyatron Electronics. And he wanted to offer Stoneham and O'Malley contracts if they moved to, and in his mind, the West Coast was a place where they should move. But just in general, they would break their contracts with their New York radio and television stations because they were leaving the city. And he was trying to sort of lobby them to think about pay TV, which was in those days unheard of. So you have three, and O'Malley, of course, had an interest in a partner. He wanted to, if he was going to move to L.A., the idea of the Giants being in San Francisco would be very attractive, especially to the other owners who are going to have to travel there. So these forces were at work on Stoneham, and he gradually saw the benefits. But interestingly, and a lot of New York history, they have Walter O'Malley leading Stoneham by the nose out of New York City, and poor old Stoneham was gullible and didn't know what was going on, and O'Malley was shrewd and brought him west. But in fact, Stoneham told O'Malley that he was leaving New York before O'Malley announced anything about the Dodgers. Stoneham made up his mind in 1957, in January and February, that he was leaving New York City. When he was going to leave was an issue, but he was leaving. And in a private conversation to O'Malley, which is recorded and it's a matter of documentation, he told O'Malley he was leaving. He was going to Minneapolis. And O'Malley basically was one of the forces that changed Stoneham's mind about location. The other two, Christopher, the mayor of San Francisco, was a great force. And then this fellow, Matthew Fox, who promised Stoneham some incredible profits if they could wire San Francisco and offer this pay-per-view TV. So those are three forces that kind of switched Stoneham's thinking and made him consider the West Coast. Now, your point about the PCL is very important. The PCL was a special league. It was not considered minor league baseball in the same sense as other places around the country. It was considered an independent league, and there was some talk in the early 50s about bringing San Francisco and Los Angeles into the league as two separate expansion teams. The owners in 1951, they heard this proposal, and they heard it again in 55. They were intrigued, but they felt it was too early yet to expand. So they tabled that motion. But there was some thinking in the air, Ian, about West Coast Major League Baseball, even then. The PCL was a very established, well-run league with incredible baseball stars. And you know the names. I mean, the DiMaggio brothers were all for the Seals, but we could tick off other players from up and down the coast. Seattle Rainiers, Portland Beavers, Sacramento Solons, Oakland Oaks, San Francisco Seals, Hollywood Stars, Los Angeles Angels, San Diego Padres. Of all those teams that I've mentioned, all those cities, 6 of them today are major league cities. So the potential was there, and it was going to come as the country sort of became smaller with jet travel and communication and all of this. By the Los Angeles opened up in 1961 to the American League, so it was coming. But the Giants and the Dodgers really broke. They were the ones that broke the dam, let the floodwaters come, if you will, in 1958. They had to pay some compensation to the Pacific Coast League because the San Francisco and Los Angeles were the 2 perhaps hot markets. But they did it because they realized the potential of Major League Baseball on the West Coast was good. And it didn't take too long for the American League to catch on that they were kind of caught off guard by the National League. And they moved out to Los Angeles in 1961. And then, as you see, all the expansion. Oakland came in 68 from Kansas City. And then, of course, Seattle had a 69 team, which only lasted a year. But you could see that it was coming. Once the Giants and the Dodgers really set the tone, West Coast baseball was on its way.
And you know something? I just want to point out something very important to you. The baseball owners approved this. The Giants and the Dodgers are going to move on my birthday in 1957, May 28th. Now, there was 2... It is great. It's such like I said, this is the kind of analysis we're going to go through. First of all, they said to them, either both teams had to move or neither could, which meant that if one team reconsidered, the others would have to change their plans as well. And second, that both teams had to announce the plans before October 1st in 57. But this is the thing that people don't know. They always, with O'Malley and this, the Giants announced it. And they had a farewell party at the Polo Grounds on September 29th. And people rushed the field to grab whatever they could. And the Dodgers didn't announce it until October 8th. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. Well, this is such a fascinating story. There are a couple of versions of the owners' meeting on your birthday in 1957. And it's all kind of cloaked because the records of Major League Baseball are sometimes, kept kind of quiet. But you're quite right. They approved both teams. There's a little bit of argument about whether it was a both or nothing, but nonetheless, let's just say they approved both teams. Now, who announces first? If you go to the transcripts, as I did, of the Emanuel Seller hearings on baseball in Washington, D.C., he was a congressman from Brooklyn. He had more or less antitrust hearings in 1951, but he also had them again in 57. And it was all about the rumors that the Dodgers were leaving Brooklyn. If you look at the transcripts of that, and by the way, this is one of the few times, I think, where you can look back and get unmediated. And what I mean by unmediated is not reporters' versions of what people say. You can actually hear pure testimony from Walter O'Malley and pure testimony from Horace Stoneman, recorded by the scribes that are taking testimony. Both men, under oath, had to testify before Congress. O'Malley did it in June. If you read O'Malley's statements, he was a master at saying, basically, the Irish have a phrase, whatever you say nothing. He was amazing, and probably his lawyerly background, he was a lawyer. He understood how to talk with, ask questions, answer questions, but maybe not really answer them, and so on. it's an amazing record of not committing himself to anything. Now, flash forward 1 month when Stoneham comes before the committee. Absolute candor. He's asked directly, are you planning to move to San Francisco? He answers, yes, I am, if I get an offer. Will you make this recommendation to your board? Yes, I will. Is this independent thinking? Does this matter if Brooklyn comes with you? No, it does not. I mean, you can go right down the list and see the candor of Stoneham, and there it was. I'm sorry about the precision of the date, but let's just say it was July 17th, 1957. It's in the middle of the month anyway. I don't have the date in front of me. The New York press corps was stunned. The issues next day were all of this, and now he quickly pointed out, I have no offer from the city of San Francisco. But if I get one, I will recommend to my board that we move. O'Malley took another, as you say, he took another at least 6 weeks, maybe 8, to announce that Brooklyn was leaving as well. Now, some say that was calculated, that he didn't want to lose the gate, that he was so nervous that if he announced that Brooklyn was leaving in July, as Stoneham did, he wouldn't have his fans come to the park. I don't know. There's a wonderful biography by Andy McHugh called Walter O'Malley. Of course, it's called Mover and Shaker. It came out about 3 years ago. It's the definitive biography of Walter O'Malley. And Andy did a wonderful job in looking at the motivations and so on, and looking at the facts of O'Malley's life. But I don't know the answer to that. Was it the gate? Was it not? Was it just cunning? I don't know. But at any rate, it is on record that you can actually hear the testimony of two men with no interpretation by reporters. You can actually hear their voices, if you will, and it's remarkable how different the two owners were.
And you know what's ironic here? What's ironic is that, again, the Dodgers were secluded in Brooklyn. It took a while to get down from the Polo Grounds and across the bridge into Brooklyn and all that. But people forget how important the Polo Grounds were. And people forget that the Yankees shared the stadium with the Giants for many years, up until the time of 23. When, if you look at the aerial shots, it's right across the river from the Polo Grounds Yankee Stadium. I mean, you could walk there in a matter of 15 minutes over the bridge over there. But what's ironic here is this. The Giants had the lock on Manhattan baseball in the early 20th century, and they had the New York Giants football team that played at the Polo Grounds. Now, everyone just remembers them playing at Yankee Stadium. That didn't happen until the mid-'50s, when, again, that hurt Stoneham, when the Giants decided to play at Yankee Stadium.
You're talking about the football Giants now.
Right, correct.
Yeah. That's right. Well, I know this about Stoneham, that, I mean, one of his when we mentioned it, that his dad put him in to sort of learn the business, one of them was scheduling. He was in charge of scheduling before he went into the front office, and that involved events other than baseball. So it was boxing. Stoneham was basically in charge of a real estate project. What do I do during the off season to get revenue? So he was very aware of other sports, and indeed, you're right that the New York Giants football team was a tenant. So were, by the way, Alex Pompez's New York Cubans. They were tenants in the Negro League. They were tenants of Stoneham's tenants. And you rightly point out, the Yankees were an early tenant of the Stoneham family. Now, Horace didn't have much to do with that, because that was more McGraw and then Charles Stoneham. But the Yankees played in Polo Grounds up until the early 20s, when Babe Ruth came to town and changed everything. And the Yankees felt, we can get our own park and we don't need to pay rent anymore. What's ironical about that is one of the decisions Stoneham was making in 1956 about where will I play? If I don't play in the Polo Grounds, where am I going to play? One idea was, let's reverse the tenancy. The Yankees were once our tenant. How about if we become tenants of the Yankees? And he was actually thinking that maybe they would play their games in Yankee Stadium. Now, that didn't work out either for a number of reasons, but that was one of the considerations of not leaving New York in 56, saying, well, we'll just go across the river here and we'll play there. So you're right. The connection between the Polo Grounds and the Yankee Stadium and the two ball clubs is historical.
Let me ask you this question. When Stoneham was prepared to move, we know that he was going to take up residence in the Seals Stadium, which was located at 16th and Bryant Streets, right from Stemple's Bakery. By the way, is Stemple's Bakery still there?
You know, I don't know. The double play, famous double play watering hole bar is still there, historic place. But that neighborhood has changed. Where the stadium is now a big store. Was a Safeway, but I think it's something else now. And there's a plaque there where you can go and see where the stadium was. But I don't know about the bakery. There was a brewery there, famously. Right, you could see the brewery on the other side of the stadium wall. But I'm not sure about the bakery.
Well, let me ask you this then. You're going from the Polo Grounds. You're going into a stadium, Seal Stadium, that only holds 23,000 people. That's more than half of a drop from Polo Grounds, even though, again, attendance was down. They only made $500,000 for the 57 season. My question to you is, did Stoneham know where Candlestick Park would be built before he moved? Because I know that the ground wasn't broken until August of 58.
He didn't know the exact location. Let me go back up just for a minute to talk about Seal Stadium. Seal Stadium was, by all opinion, the jewel of minor league baseball. It was a beautiful, beautiful park. It seated just a bit over 20, maybe 20, close to 21,000. When Stoneham came to town, he convinced Paul Fagan, the owner of the Seals, who owned also Seal Stadium at 16th and Bryant, to add another 2,500 seats. They got it up almost to 23,000. There was no advertising. I remember talking to Willie Mays and Willie McCovey about this. They said it was like playing, not quite in a spring training venue because it had quite doubled the capacity, but he said it was like the friendly confines of the Cubs, Wrigley Field. It was an intimacy. McCovey told me that you could talk to the fans and they talked to you. Vince Scully told me a very funny story about broadcasting there. He said that the fans would get involved in the commercials with him because he was right sitting among them. So it's one of those intimate kind of places. And it was in a way, ironically, a perfect venue to grow a fan base with a new team because they were so close to the players. And this had an effect on. Now, one thing to remind ourselves, you mentioned the Polo Grounds being cavernous. 56. Am I right about 56,000 that you could fit into the Polo Grounds?
Yeah, you're talking 56,000 and a 490-foot center field.
Yeah, we know about the dimensions. Surely it's a big place. Well, think about this. This is mind-boggling. The Giants more than doubled their attendance in 1958 from 57, despite the fact that they were playing in a place that held less than 23,000. And Stoneham was so happy with that. I mean, any doubts he had about moving out of New York City were the first year were simply wiped away when he saw that phenomenal increase. And the next year, 1959, the last year they played in Seal Stadium, when they were in a torrid pennant race, there was a possibility that a World Series was going to be played in Seal Stadium because the Giants were 2 games up with 8 games to go. And then, collapsed, the famous collapse of 59. But nonetheless, they drew 1,400,000 people in 59, exceeding the amount of 58. So when you look at New York attendance in 57, 56, 55, these numbers at Seal Stadium are amazing. and it gave Stoneham, I guess, the kind of confidence he needed to say, I've made the right decision. I moved west. It was the right thing to do.
And, of course, the bottom line is the most important. But let's get to the fans here, because this is an amazing thing.
Well, I wanted to go. If I think I did not answer the question, and I just go back for a minute. I just digressed on Steel Stadium. You asked, did Stoneham know where he was going to be playing? Not initially. All he knew was that in the letter which Christopher and Fran McCarty, the president of the Board of Supervisors, wrote this letter. It was a letter of offering, if you will, a letter of promise to the Giants by the city of San Francisco. It included all the things that they were willing to provide if the Giants would move, and it was a stadium of over 42,000. But the key was parking lot. Stoneham wanted a parking lot with 10,000 plus cars. There was no place in Manhattan, no place up by the Polo Grounds where he could get that. And so he believed that the future of American life, and I have to say he was pretty right about this, was the automobile. Post-World War II, he saw the mostly white middle class leaving the city, going out to the suburbs, and he knew that the automobile was going to be an important factor in American life, and he wanted fans to come to the game where a place they could park their cars. So this was important, and Mayor Christopher and his cohorts realized they've got to find a place where there was ample parking. This was a key to Stoneham's thinking at the time. And the one place they've had was 10 miles from downtown, but still in the city of San Francisco, at what was called Bayview or Candlestick Point. And that's where they ended up building the baseball park. Now, we all know in retrospect that was a bad decision. The Giants, their fortunes there were, you could write a whole, well, indeed, I treat some of this in the book that way. It's just one of those decisions that had a long-term effect on the success of the ball team. But at the time, the city was looking for a place for a quick fix like this, and this was a location that was far away from downtown, and it was in a windy part of the city where the hills were all conveying, and you could get terrible afternoon weather and so on. But they decided that's where they're going to go. Stoneham went out on a morning, very famous story. They took him out on one of his visits in the fall, and they showed him the place where they're going to build the park. And it was a nice, balmy morning and so on. And he was there less than an hour. He kept looking out at this vast space for parking, and they were trying to talk to him about the stadium. He said, "Oh, this is great. I'm sure this is going to be a wonderful thing. Let's go downtown and have lunch, and we'll talk about it." So they did a customary photo op with him looking over the shoulders of people and so on. And they might have even had hard hats, as they do in those pictures. But it took less than an hour. And Stoneham was back in downtown San Francisco talking about the future of the Giants there. So that's a very famous moment, and it's a story that's been told over and over again. Conversely, when Chub Feeney went out 6 months later when they were actually under construction, he went out in the afternoon when the famous afternoon winds blow in, and he saw crazy things happen. One of those porta potties that they have on the construction site actually blew over. And he turned to one of the workers and he said, "Wow, does it blow like this out here all the time?" And the fellow said, "Oh no, only between 1 and 4 every day." So this is another story that's gone into legend and folklore. That Chub Feeney found out too late that the winds really blew out here.
Son, when you think about it, again, San Francisco did not have a subway at the time. All it had was the trolley cars, really. And how do people travel in California? By car. Such a cross from New York City, where everything's dependent upon public transportation, the train, the bus.
Yeah, that's right.
You don't need a car. So, in retrospect, Stoneham's vision not only was to change locations, but to integrate the Giants into California society by having a parking lot which is accessible in the downtown area.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Look at Dodger Stadium. I mean, O'Malley. Even today, it's an elaborate parking system with levels and big letters of telling you what part of the parking lot you're going to. I mean, it's very, very interesting that both of these owners understood California lifestyle, the automobile, and how it was a big factor in the ballpark.
And I got the new book, City of Dreams, about the building of Chavez Ravine, and I'm going to have the author on my show next month. But we're not even going to get out of the 1950s today. We're going to have you back on the show. I'll tell you that much. I told you, my questioning's a little different than most of the interviews you're ever going to know, because I go into in depth, and it necessarily doesn't have to be in the book, but it's an important thing for people to know this, because not a lot of people know about it. You mentioned you were at the ceremony when the Giants came to San Francisco, and of course you write about how the city welcomed them. Well, let's go back to that April day in 1958.
Well, it was pretty phenomenal. I mean, it was so phenomenal in a way that Life magazine decided to put the image of the Giants, Willie Mays, in a car with all these fans around him, and 2,000 fans ringing the Montgomery Street and onto Market Street. West Coast baseball. The major leagues come to the West Coast. I mean, something like that. It was an event that was amazing, and the city really initially there was a strange kind of comparison, because we had the Seals, but their day, the day of the Major League Baseball was coming. There was a man called Curly Grieve. He was the sports editor of the San Francisco Examiner. And he was the voice of this movement. He started in 1952 or 53, writing about the possibility of Major League Baseball coming to San Francisco. And in general, he was the leading voice, the leading advocate, if you will, of bringing Major League Baseball to the West Coast. And he built up gradually support among other writers and so on. They loved the Seals. The city loved the Seals, but they knew the time was coming when baseball would be here. So there was this interesting tension between the old giving way to the new. Now, couple that with the fact that most San Franciscans didn't feel they needed anything New York to make them into a quote-unquote big league city. San Francisco and San Franciscans felt, thank you very much, we're a big city. We have culture. We don't need New York to tell anything New York. So the resistance, there was what I'm trying to get at, Ian, is that there was a strain of resistance, despite the euphoria in general with the public and with the city. There was also a kind of restraint. And Willie Mays' biographer, Charles Einstein, covers this so well, this tension, this interesting tension between euphoria, welcoming the Giants, and at the same time resisting New York influence. And the fellow they took it out on was the only superstar the Giants had, number 24, Willie Mays. He comes west, and he is the personification of New York, because all of his exploits, the famous catch in 1954, the throw in 1951 to nail Billy Cox at the plate, the Gold Glove, the home runs, the roaming the polo grounds in center field, all these exploits that we knew about as kids because we would read about Major League Baseball. He was coming as a New York Giants player. Well, the press and the local fans said, well, yeah, he's a great player, but wait a minute. Who played center field for the Seals? Well, we've got pretty good players. And then, interestingly, there was a shift, and rather than focus on Mays, they adopted people like Orlando Cepeda, who had no history in New York, who was absolutely first and foremost a San Francisco Giant. So there was among the press, there was a kind of strategy of reinvention, how to take a New York team, if you will, a New York entity, and convert it into something distinctly San Franciscan. And that happens by not ignoring Mays, but treating him with a bit of restraint, not going crazy over his exploits, and rather focusing on Willie McCovey, Orlando Cepeda, people who had no history in New York, who were strictly speaking San Francisco Giants. Now, it didn't take too long for Mays to be converted into a native. By 1962, the great pennant season, Mays had 4 years already in a San Francisco uniform. The locals were happy to consider him a native son and recognize him as the great player he was, and probably the game's best player. But initially, there was this tension about not going too crazy because he was New York. Let's focus on these younger guys who have no New York connections, and these are the real San Francisco Giants. So it was an interesting. If you read the articles, as I did preparing for the book in the 1958 and 59 sports writers, they were caught here, kind of in the project of reinvention, and at the same time, how do you deal with a great one like Mays, whose history was New York? So it was really interesting.
And you know something? You make a good point with Zapata and McCovey, because they would be the basis for the Giants in the 1960s. And we're not going to get to it on this show, but those teams are very good. Unfortunately, you had a Dodger team and a St. Louis team that were just as good. And I know you labeled one of your chapters Bridesmaids, but they were right up there with these guys, along with the Alou brothers and Alvin Dock managing, and all the turmoil. But good.
Absolutely no question about the 1960 Giants. The baseball that was being played from 58 until 68. Let's just pick that. There's a 10-year swing there. Absolutely outstanding baseball. And by the way, all the pundits, when the Giants moved west in 58, they had finished in the second division in 57 in the National League. They were down in the second division. This is where they assumed they were going to be. The Giants surprised everybody with all this new talent, and were contending for the pennant in their first year in San Francisco. And as I said a minute ago, in 59, they almost won the pennant. So this new infusion of new names, if you will, this transforming the old 1957 New York Giants, who finished so poorly, into this other team was part of this change that was going on in the front office, bringing in Latinos, as you pointed out, bringing in new African-American players and other players through the trade. Harvey Keene came, Bob Schmidt. Jimmy Davenport was a rookie, but he was brought in. These were all players that had no history with the New York Giants. So it was an easy transition for sports writers to kind of focus on this. But you're right. They finished. It's hard to imagine this. From 1964 to 1968, under Herman Franks, after Dark was let go, they finished second every year. Couldn't quite get over the top, but remarkable finishes in those 4 seasons. And if you look at the overall one-loss, records, the Giants were remarkable. And it was either one year it was the Dodgers, one year it was the Cardinals. You're quite right. It wasn't, it was the same team. But there they were. The Giants were always up there and just couldn't quite make the push. So the fans were lucky. We were very lucky. I was a young man during this time. We got to see some very, very good baseball and some very, very good players in Giants uniforms.
You see, I came along in 1970, so I always remember the Giants really being terrible until the mid-'80s, and then, of course, 89.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this question. First of all, I'm just going to say, in 58, Zapata won the Rookie of the Year. McCovey wins it the next year. They both win it at Seal Stadium over there. Now, the building of Candlestick Park is a pain in the ass of itself. What happened?
Well, this is boy. You could talk forever about this.
I know.
the city was complicit, in my opinion, because they wanted a quick fix, as we talked about it before. There were a lot of shenanigans. Let's put it this way: stuff that went on then probably couldn't go on today with all the transparency, but they made deals in those days, and the city was bound and determined not to have any problems. They wanted to get their stadium built, and they wanted it built quickly. And they opened in 1960. Now, the Dodgers took their time. They had their own problems. It wasn't easy for Walter O'Malley. He had a lot of problems at the beginning with land use and some eviction problems that were not great for the Dodgers' publicity. But not so for the Giants. They had the property, and the man who owned the property was a builder, and he bought swampland really for $2,000 an acre in 1952 and 53, and sold it back to the city, if you can imagine, for $67,000 an acre. But the city was desperate because they needed about 75 acres for this parking lot. And they picked an area where, as I said, the weather was very, very notorious. And Harney, the man who was the construction mogul, he got involved in this project, people say, not to make a lot of money, but he wanted the park to be named after him. He wanted it to be called Harney Stadium. So the first thing he did was, when they started working on the project, by the way, one of the concessions the city had to make was, he said, I want $67,000 per acre, but I also want, if I sell you this land, I want to be the guy who builds the stadium. And the city agreed to both of those because they knew that there was going to be no difficulty in acquiring more acreage. If they did it in any other location, they'd have to condemn buildings, they'd have to go into different costs and so on. So this was a dream come true, that you could deal with one person and get it all done in one fell swoop. However, Harney turned out to be a problematic guy. He began, first of all, he painted all the trucks, all of the equipment, Harney Stadium on the side of all the trucks. Then he demanded that the city's blueprints all reflect the name Harney Stadium. Well, this was before anybody had any idea what it was going to be called. Finally, the city's Parks and Recreation Commission decided the best way to handle this was to have a contest, citywide contest among everybody, and they did it through the newspapers. And the most popular name that came through by far was to name it Candlestick Park after its location, historic location, which was Candlestick Point. Well, when that happened, Harney was quite miffed and began slowdowns, which took the project considerably longer to finish. Nonetheless, they opened their doors in April of 1960, 2 years before the Dodgers opened their doors for the new stadium. But the problems continued to persist. To get it done in 1960 and open the doors, they had to cut corners. Harney got more and more difficult. There were lawsuits, counter lawsuits, withholding Harney's pay. Then he would sue the city. As a result, lots of things happened to the park that were crazy. One famous story, Ian, if I could just digress.
Okay.
Harney was losing his focus because he was so upset with this business of the name that he decided to overlook certain things in the contract. So when Matty Schwab was the groundskeeper at the time, he came out into the outfield. He noticed there were no sprinkler heads. So he went back to Harney and he said, well, we've got to have sprinkler heads. So then he went to the architect and he said, the architect went to Harney and said, look, you got to put in sprinkler heads. Harney was so miffed, said, well, you're going to have to pay for them. Well, they said, we'll talk about that later. So he goes and orders the sprinkler heads put into the outfield. Well, he left them 4 inches above the ground, all over the place. So Matty Schwab had to point out the obvious, that it's hard enough playing the outfield in Major League Baseball without having to dodge sprinkler heads. So he went back to Harney. Harney had to redo the entire project. Again, this made him more angry. And these were little things like that happened all through the construction that made Candlestick kind of a nightmare in preparation. Not to mention that once the park was settled, they opened their doors, and after the euphoria if you will, of the newness of the park wore off, people realized you have to bring overcoats and blankets to night games. Roger Angell, the famous New Yorker columnist and wonderful writer of baseball, referred to a night at Candlestick Park akin to being an elite rite of passage, that you had to sit out in the elements in the icebergs, to kind of prove your manhood. It was that kind of a place at night. You just never knew of the temperature. Could be mid-July and you'd be in overcoats with blankets.
That's amazing. I always think, hey, San Francisco, California, although it's in a higher elevation than Southern California, they call those folks up there NorCal. I didn't know until I got older that the weather quickly changes from, could be 78 degrees and then go down to like 40 degrees at night.
Well, one problem is that the city's built on hills, and there are these famous gaps, they call them. And one of them, the most notorious, is the one called the Alemany Gap. And in the summertime, because of the confluence and the switches in the elements, it actually draws the air off the Pacific Ocean and pushes it east. And if you look at the Alemany Gap in a geological survey, you'll see it comes right through Candlestick Point. So that particular part of San Francisco is cooler and more windy than other parts of San Francisco. Felipe Alou told me in an interview that he wished that they would have talked to him about this. He was a rookie, of course, in 1958, 59, but brand new to the ball team. But anyway, he loved to fish, still does. And he would go out to Candlestick Point because it was a local fishing area, and he said he had such trouble casting. Everybody's line was getting all, twisted in the air and so on, and he said he knew when he heard that the ballpark is going to be built there, he said, my goodness, this is going to be difficult. He also told me in the same interview, as a kind of aside, he said, I really kind of enjoyed playing right field at Candlestick, perversely. He said the wind blew so hard in my face that I could actually lean into it to rest. So that's another one of those Candlestick lore stories that we know about.
Well, this is what we're going to do. I have to end my inquiry because this has been an hour. Can you believe it's an hour? That went by like nothing. Everyone's always like, hey, Ian, you sure we could go an hour? I can go about 3 hours with the Giants, And
oh, man.
we're going to have to, we can go, we'll get you back on the show. Hang the line for a second. Let me end the show, and then I'll talk to you after. Folks, this is a great book. Next time we're gonna label this one part 1, but next time when we get Robert back on the show and his wonderful book Home Team, we're going to talk about the pitfalls of Candlestick Park. We'll begin our inquiry, how it affected the All-Star Game and Stu Miller and the World Series, and we'll talk about 60s Giants baseball and probably get into the 70s. And we're going to have to just wait to do from like 75 to 2000 because these shows are just great. And the analysis is just wonderful. Go out, go buy the book. Besides Amazon, when can we get this, Robert?
Well, I'm hoping you can get it in your local bookstore. I'm sure that if you went in and asked, they could order it for you. But the other place to get it is the University of Nebraska has a spring catalog, 2017 spring catalog, and you can get the book at the University of Nebraska Press. So that would be another outlet for you.
Go out, folks. Get this book. I really enjoyed it. I'm not even into the 60s yet, and that's how much information that's covered. And a lot of the stuff that was shrouded in pretty much mystery has been told to you today that, hey, the Giants were just as instrumental moving west as the Dodgers. And, in fact, the Giants announced it first, like we mentioned earlier. As always, I'm Ian Kahanowitz. I'm your host. And thank you, Robert, for being here. And it
was a pleasure, Ian, to be on your show.
Oh, it was great. It's we're going to have you back. I'm going to have to make a couple more dates with you. I'll be sending you an email after this. Hang on the line. Folks, as I always on the show, in the immortal words of Everett R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.